June 19th, 1944. Philippine Sea, Western Pacific, 1100 hours. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the bridge of the carrier Taiho, Japan's newest and most heavily armoured flattop, watching the horizon through his binoculars. His mobile fleet had sailed from Tawi Tawi 5 days earlier, with explicit orders from Combined Fleet Headquarters. The Americans were invading Saipan. This would be the decisive battle, Japan's last chance to destroy the enemy carrier force and turn the tide of the war. Ozawa had studied the intelligence reports carefully. His staff had assured him the Americans possessed perhaps 7 or 8 carriers in the region, enough to be dangerous, certainly, but manageable. His own force included 9 carriers, supported by battleships and cruisers. More importantly, his aircraft had a 100-mile range advantage. He could strike the Americans before they could strike back. But what Ozawa saw through his field glasses that morning made no sense. Carrier after carrier stretched across the sea, Essex-Class flat tops, their massive decks bristling with aircraft. 1, 2, 5, 8. The count kept rising. Beyond them, battleships and cruisers in perfect formation, their radar masts rotating, searching. This was not the modest force intelligence had described. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This was an armada that seemed to have no end. How many do they have? Ozawa muttered to his chief of staff. The question hung in the tropical air, unanswered, because neither man could comprehend what they were seeing. The Americans were not supposed to have this many carriers. Japan's own shipyards, working desperately for 3 years, had managed to complete barely 20 carriers of all types since Pearl Harbor. Yet here, in a single battle group, the enemy had deployed 15 fleet and light carriers, not replacing losses, not making do with what remained, deploying carriers as if they were destroyers, in numbers that defied every calculation. Japanese planners had made about American industrial capacity. Within hours, Ozawa's carefully planned attack would dissolve into catastrophe. His aircraft would be slaughtered in what American pilots would mockingly call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. 3 of his carriers would sink. His air groups would cease to exist. But the shock that morning was not simply tactical. It was the sudden, crushing realization that Japan had been fighting an enemy whose industrial power operated by rules no Japanese admiral understood. For the men commanding Japan's Imperial Navy, aircraft carriers represented the nation's most precious military assets. Each one required years of construction, careful craftsmanship, and resources Japan could barely afford. The Shokaku-class carriers, Japan's finest, had taken 3.5 to 4 years to build. From keel laying to commissioning, each represented an enormous investment of steel, skilled labor, and irreplaceable time. Shokaku herself had been laid down in December of 1937 at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. The work proceeded with meticulous care. Master shipwrights supervised every stage. Riveters, trained through years of apprenticeship, installed approximately 1 million rivets per ship, each heated and hammered into place by crews working in perfect coordination. A skilled riveting team might install 100 rivets in a day. The work could not be rushed, could not be simplified. Each rivet represented a precise joining of overlapping steel plates, requiring exact alignment and tremendous physical labor. The hull took shape slowly. Frames were erected, plates were positioned, thousands of rivets were driven home. The machinery was installed. The island superstructure rose. The flight deck was laid. Every system was tested, retested, inspected. On June 1, 1939, 18 months after construction began, Shokaku slid into the water, but she was far from complete. Another 14 months of fitting out followed, installing electronics, calibrating systems, training the crew. On August 8, 1941, 44 months after her keel was laid, Shokaku was finally commissioned into service. Her sister ship Zuikaku followed a similar timeline, laid down in May of 1938, launched November of 1939, commissioned September of 1941, 40 months from start to finish. This was not unusual. This was how carriers were built. Complex warships required time, 3 years, 4 years, sometimes longer if resources were scarce or bombings disrupted production. By 1944, Japan had commissioned 20 carriers total since the war began. 20. Each one a triumph of engineering, representing months or years of concentrated effort by Japan's limited number of skilled shipyard workers. When one was sunk, the loss was catastrophic, not simply in tactical terms, but in the knowledge that replacing it would require 3 or 4 years Japan did not have. The mathematics of attrition had always favored Japan at the war's beginning: sink American carriers faster than they could be replaced, and eventually the United States would be forced to negotiate. This calculation assumed American shipyards operated under the same constraints as Japanese ones, that carriers required years to construct, that there existed fundamental limits to how quickly complex warships could be built. What Japanese admirals did not know, could not have imagined, was that on the other side of the Pacific, a revolution in shipbuilding had rendered every one of those assumptions obsolete. Newport News, Virginia, April 28, 1941, 7 in the morning. The massive building way at Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company stood ready. Workers moved into position as a crane operator prepared to lower the first keel plate. The foreman checked his watch. They were beginning construction of USS Essex, lead ship of what would become the largest class of fleet carriers in history. The Navy needed these ships desperately. War with Japan seemed increasingly likely. The existing carrier force was inadequate. Too few ships, not enough deck space, limited aircraft capacity. But there was a problem. Traditional carrier construction took 3 to 4 years, building them the way battleships had always been built, riveting every joint, crafting each section individually, using skilled tradesmen who had learned their craft over decades. At that pace, even if they started immediately, the first Essex-Class carriers would not be ready until 1944 or 45. By then, it might be too late. Yet the men supervising construction at Newport News that morning had a different plan. They had studied the techniques Henry Kaiser was pioneering with Liberty ships: prefabrication, modular assembly, and most controversially, welding instead of riveting. Maritime traditionalists had dismissed these methods as unsuitable for warships. Too fast meant too sloppy. Welding lacked the proven reliability of rivets. Shortcuts would produce inferior vessels. But the United States Maritime Commission and the Navy's Bureau of Ships had run the calculations. Riveting accounted for 1/3 of construction time and labor costs. 1 million rivets per carrier, each requiring skilled workers, each taking time. Welding could be done faster, much faster. And critically, welders could be trained quickly. A complete novice could learn basic welding in a week, master the essential techniques in a month. Within 3 months, a former secretary, a housewife, a farmer could produce welds as strong as any riveter's work. The implications were staggering. If carriers could be welded instead of riveted, if hull sections could be prefabricated in parallel rather than assembled sequentially, if the work could be divided among newly trained workers rather than relying solely on traditional craftsmen, then perhaps the impossible was possible. Perhaps a fleet carrier could be built not in 4 years, but in 20 months. 16 months, maybe even less. The keel plate settled into place. USS Essex had begun, and with it, a transformation in naval warfare that would determine the outcome of the Pacific War. The Essex-Class design had been finalized in February of 1940, no longer constrained by the Washington Naval Treaty, which had finally expired. The designers could build the carrier they actually needed, rather than the compromised vessel treaty limits had forced. 27,000 tons, 872 feet long, capable of carrying 90 to 100 aircraft, powered by 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, driving Westinghouse turbines generating 150,000 horsepower, top speed 33 knots, range 20,000 nautical miles. But the real innovation was not in the design specifications, it was in how the ships would be built. Newport News broke the construction process into parallel workflows. Hull sections were prefabricated in covered assembly areas. While one team erected frames on the building way, others welded deck sections, constructed the island superstructure, assembled machinery components. The work no longer proceeded linearly from keel to launch. Instead, dozens of tasks happened simultaneously. When a section was complete, cranes weighing up to 150 tons lifted it into position. Welders joined the sections together. The ship took shape at a pace that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. The workforce expanded dramatically. In April of 1943, Newport News employed 31,000 workers. Most had never built a ship before. Many were women, former teachers, office workers, the thousands of WWII welders who took their welding torches into the tightest, most confined spaces in the hull. The work below the waterline, where poor welds would mean leaks and death, work that required precision and patience and steady hands. They learned fast. They had to. Instructors demonstrated the technique, how to strike the arc, how to control the puddle, how to move at the right speed to create a strong joint without burning through. The students practiced. Again and again. The simple welds first, then the more complex ones, the ones in awkward positions, the ones that mattered most. Within weeks, they were working on actual ship sections, welding the seams that would hold back the Pacific Ocean, creating joints as strong or stronger than any riveted connection, doing it faster than any riveting crew could match. And there were thousands of them. An army of newly trained workers, many of whom had never imagined they would build warships, now producing carriers at a speed that rewrote every assumption about naval construction. USS Essex was launched on July 31, 1942, 15 months after her keel was laid. She commissioned on December 31, 1942. Total construction time, 20 months. Less than half the time required for a Japanese carrier, but Essex was just the beginning. USS Yorktown, the second ship, was laid down in December of 1941. She commissioned in April of 1943, 16.5 months. USS Lexington, 17 months. USS Intrepid, 17 months. USS Franklin, built at the same Newport News yard, held the record. 14 months from keel to commissioning. 14 months, the time it took Japan to fit out a carrier after launch. America built one complete from keel to combat ready. And Newport News was not the only yard building Essex-Class carriers. The Fall River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, the New York Naval Shipyard in Brooklyn, the Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Portsmouth, Virginia, the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, 5 yards, all building Essex-Class carriers simultaneously, each delivering ships on schedules that would have been dismissed as fantasy before the war. By April of 1945, Newport News had delivered 8 Essex-Class carriers in less than 30 months, 1 carrier every 90 days, not replacing losses, not struggling to maintain force levels, simply adding to an ever-growing fleet that Japan had no hope of matching. The numbers told a story of industrial dominance that transcended any tactical consideration. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States commissioned 24 Essex-Class fleet carriers. Japan built 6 fleet carriers during the entire war. America produced 9 Independence-class light carriers converted from cruiser hulls. Japan managed 8 light carriers. Most staggering were the escort carriers, the small jeep carriers that screened convoys and supported amphibious operations. America launched 122. Japan built 6. In total, the United States commissioned 151 carriers of all types during the war. Japan managed 20, a ratio of more than 7 to 1. But even that number understated the disparity, because American carriers were being built faster than Japan could sink them. By 1944, the U.S. was launching carriers at a rate that meant even catastrophic losses would be replaced within months. For Japanese naval planners, who had based their entire strategy on the assumption that sinking American carriers would gradually erode U.S. naval power, the reality was incomprehensible. They were not fighting a navy. They were fighting an industrial system that treated fleet carriers the way Japan treated destroyers, as mass-produced weapons that could be replaced faster than they could be destroyed. The shock was not limited to numbers. It was the speed, the relentlessness, the apparent ease with which America conjured carriers from its shipyards. Japanese intelligence officers studied reconnaissance photographs with growing confusion. New carriers appeared in American ports with disturbing regularity. Hulls that had not existed months earlier now steamed toward the Pacific, fully equipped and combat-ready. The analysts checked their records, cross-referenced ship names, tried to determine which carriers were new and which were repaired vessels returning to service. The conclusion they reached seemed impossible. These were not repaired ships, they were new construction. Carriers that had been steel plates and girders 18 months earlier now carried air groups toward Japanese-held islands. The Americans were building fleet carriers faster than Japan built destroyers. Admiral Ozawa himself later wrote in his private journal, an entry captured after the war, "We believed American industrial power was great, but we assumed it operated under the same physical laws as our own, that a carrier required 3 years to build, that skilled workers were scarce, that there were limits to production. We were wrong about everything." The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944 brought this disparity into crushing focus. Ozawa commanded 9 carriers, 3 fleet carriers, 2 converted carriers, 4 light carriers. His air groups had been rebuilt after the losses of 1942 and 43. The pilots were less experienced than the veterans of Pearl Harbor, but they were trained, the aircraft were capable, the plan was sound. Strike the American carriers from beyond their attack range, use land-based aircraft from Guam to support the attack, shuttle bomb the enemy. Aircraft would launch from carriers, strike the American fleet, then land at Guam to refuel and rearm before returning. The Americans would be hit repeatedly by waves they could not counter because Japanese aircraft could reach them while American planes were still out of range. It should have worked. It would have worked earlier in the war. But by June of 1944, everything had changed. Task Force 58, under Admiral Mark Mitcher, deployed 15 carriers, 7 Essex-Class fleet carriers, 8 light carriers. Together they embarked over 900 aircraft, not counting the air groups from escort carriers supporting the Saipan invasion. The sheer scale overwhelmed Japanese planning. Ozawa's 9 carriers, even if every aircraft launched successfully, could put perhaps 430 planes in the air, less than half the American strength. And the Americans had radar, the new technology that gave them eyes beyond the horizon. At 11:07 on the morning of June 19th, radar operators aboard the carriers detected Ozawa's first strike wave while the Japanese aircraft were still 60 miles distant. Fighter directors aboard the carriers used the information to vector Hellcats into perfect intercept positions. The Japanese pilots, expecting surprise, instead flew into a coordinated defensive screen that destroyed them before they reached the carriers. Wave after wave, Ozawa launched his aircraft. Wave after wave, American fighters slaughtered them. Of 373 Japanese planes sent against Task Force 58 that day, more than 300 were destroyed. American losses totaled 29 aircraft. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American pilots called it, a one-sided massacre that eliminated Japan's rebuilt carrier air groups in a single day. But for Ozawa, standing on Taiho's bridge, the shock was not simply the tactical defeat. It was the realization that hit when he looked at the American formation. Those 15 carriers represented perhaps 18 months of American construction time. 18 months. Japan's entire carrier force, built over a decade, fielded 9 ships. America had deployed nearly double that number in a single battle group. And this was not America's entire carrier force. Other carriers operated elsewhere in the Pacific. More were completing construction. The stream seemed endless. And then, as if to punctuate the storm, hopelessness, American submarines struck. USS Albacore torpedoed Taiho, Ozawa's flagship. USS Kavala torpedoed Shokaku. Both carriers, damaged but seemingly manageable, became floating bombs as gasoline vapors from ruptured fuel lines accumulated in their hangar decks. Poor damage control turned single torpedo hits into catastrophic explosions. Taiho exploded and sank. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this, taking over 1,600 men with her. Shokaku, veteran of every major carrier battle from Pearl Harbor onward, erupted in flames and went down, killing 1,200, two of Japan's most capable carriers, destroyed not by overwhelming force but by submarines and poor engineering, while the American carriers attacked repeatedly, absorbed damage, and continued operations. The disparity was not simply in numbers, it was in design philosophy. In damage control training, in the industrial capacity to produce better ships, better aircraft, better everything. Ozawa transferred his flag to a cruiser and withdrew. His carrier force, Japan's last hope for offensive naval operations, had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Not because of lack of courage, not because of inferior tactics, but because Japan had brought 9 carriers to a fight where the enemy deployed 15, with dozens more building in American shipyards. The Pacific War had been decided not at Midway, as historians would later claim, but in the shipyards of Newport News, Brooklyn, Philadelphia, and Norfolk. It had been decided the moment American welders learned their craft and began producing carriers at a pace Japan could not match. The battles simply revealed what industrial mathematics had already determined, but the shock extended beyond the raw numbers of carriers built. It was the operational tempo, the relentlessness. Japanese carriers, when damaged, limped home to shipyards that were overwhelmed with work. Zuikaku, hit at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August of 1942, required 6 months of repairs. 6 months during which she could not operate, could not train her air group, could not contribute to the fleet. When she finally returned to service, American shipyards had delivered 4 more Essex-Class carriers. Shokaku, damaged at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October of 1942, spent even longer in repair. Bomb damage and crew losses meant months of reconstruction, months during which American carriers maintained constant offensive operations. American carriers, by contrast, returned to action with startling speed. USS Yorktown, badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942, steamed to Pearl Harbor for emergency repairs. Shipyard workers and the carrier's crew labored around the clock. 72 hours later, Yorktown sailed for Midway. She was not fully repaired, patches covered bomb damage, systems remained degraded, but she was operational enough to fight, and she did, helping to sink 4 Japanese carriers before finally succumbing to torpedo damage. That philosophy, of rapid repair and immediate return to operations, became standard practice. American carriers hit by kamikazes received emergency repairs that would have taken Japanese shipyards months, accomplished in weeks or days. Floating dry docks accompanied the fleet, allowing repairs at advanced bases without the need to return to the United States. In February of 1945 alone, 52 U.S. Navy vessels received repairs in floating dry docks scattered across the Pacific. USS Randolph, hit by a kamikaze at Ulithi in March of 1945, received repairs alongside the repair ship USS Jason, while still in the forward area. The repairs were completed well enough that Randolph continued operations without ever returning to the United States for major shipyard work. For Japan, such damage would have meant months in dry dock. For America, it meant inconvenience. The industrial capacity extended to every detail. American carriers operated aircraft elevators that could move a plane from the hangar deck to the flight deck in 15 seconds. Japanese elevators required 30 seconds. Over hundreds of sorties, this difference translated to entire additional strike waves launched per day. When Japanese pilots complained of exhaustion from flying multiple missions, American carriers were already launching fresh strikes because their elevator systems were simply faster. The rhythm of American carrier operations testified to an industrial system that never paused, never exhausted itself, never ran short. By 1945, during the invasion of Okinawa, Task Force 58 deployed 40 carriers, 40. More than double the total number Japan had commissioned during the entire war. They carried nearly 1,500 aircraft. Japanese pilots who managed to penetrate the defensive screens and glimpse the American fleet described something beyond military force. They spoke of despair, of sailing against an iron horizon. One pilot, in his diary recovered after his death, wrote, "They are not ships, they are factories at sea. We strike and strike again, and still they come." What the Japanese could not see, what made the despair complete, was that for every carrier they glimpsed on the horizon, more were under construction. The building ways at Newport News remained busy. Brooklyn Naval Yard continued laying keels. Philadelphia kept launching hulls. The production system that had delivered 24 Essex-Class carriers by war's end never slowed, never exhausted its capacity. And when kamikazes struck with desperate fury in the war's final months, the American response demonstrated the full depth of industrial dominance. USS Franklin, hit by 2 bombs in March of 1945, suffered catastrophic damage. Over 800 men killed, massive fires, the flight deck ruptured. Any Japanese carrier would have sunk. Franklin stayed afloat. Her crew fought the fires. She steamed under her own power to Pearl Harbor, then on to the United States for repairs. She was too damaged to return to combat before war's end, but she survived. USS Bunker Hill, struck by 2 kamikazes in May of 1945, lost nearly 400 crew. Fires raged, explosions devastated the hangar deck. The ship seemed finished, but damage control parties extinguished the fires. The carrier withdrew from combat, but survived. Her air group simply transferred to other carriers and continued operations that same afternoon. For Japan, losing a carrier meant the collapse of an entire fleet operation. For America, it meant transferring squadrons to the dozens of other carriers steaming nearby. The mathematics were ruthless, relentless, undeniable. Japan had entered the war believing it could win through superior training, better tactics, Bushido spirit. The assumption was that if Japanese forces fought hard enough, sacrificed enough, they could overcome American material advantages. But there existed no amount of fighting spirit that could overcome an industrial disparity, where the enemy produced 7 carriers for every one you built, where they built each carrier in 16 months while yours required 40, where damage that would destroy your ships barely slowed theirs. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, later reflected on this reality in his memoirs published in 1960. "We fought across 5,000 miles of Pacific Ocean, supplied by ships built faster than the enemy could sink them." Japan's military planners assumed American industrial capacity was impressive but finite. They believed that if they sank enough ships, eventually American logistics would collapse and we would be forced to negotiate. They failed to account for the shipyards. By 1944, we were replacing losses faster than Japan could inflict them. Industrial capacity, not martial valor, determined the outcome. The welders made the difference. The women working in Newport News and Brooklyn and Philadelphia, former secretaries and teachers and farm workers who learned in weeks what had traditionally taken years. They created 50 miles of welds per carrier, joints as strong as any rivet, completed faster than any riveting crew could match. Multiplied across thousands of workers, across 5 shipyards, across 24 carriers, those welds represented an industrial transformation that changed naval warfare forever. For the Japanese admirals who had assumed carriers required years to build, who had calculated attrition rates based on Japanese construction timelines, the revelation was shattering. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of Battleship Division 1, wrote in his diary after witnessing the American carrier fleet off Okinawa, "We understood intellectually that American production exceeded ours, but understanding numbers on paper differs from seeing the reality, carrier after carrier, stretching beyond the horizon, each one built in the time we would need to repair a damaged destroyer. This is not warfare. This is industrial annihilation." After the surrender, captured Japanese naval officers were debriefed by American intelligence. The conversations, preserved in National Archives documents, revealed the psychological impact of the carrier disparity. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, stated plainly, "We could not understand how you built so many. It was like trying to fight the horizon itself. Every time we sank one, 3 appeared. We knew we were already defeated when we saw the Essex-Class carriers. Not defeated in battle, defeated by your shipyards." Another officer, when asked what single factor most contributed to Japan's defeat, answered without hesitation, "Your welders. We built carriers with rivets and craftsmen and time we did not have. You built them with welding and ordinary workers trained in weeks. We lost the war in 1941 when your shipyards adopted welding. The battles merely confirmed what your industrial system had already decided." The lesson was broader than tactics or technology. It was about the nature of industrial warfare in the 20th century. Traditional measures of military power, the quality of individual ships, the bravery of crews, the skill of commanders, mattered less than the ability to produce and replace and outlast. Japan had brought a pre-industrial military philosophy to an industrial war. America had transformed shipbuilding from a craft into mass production. The transformation did not end with the war. The techniques pioneered building Essex-Class carriers, the prefabrication, the modular assembly, the welding technology, the rapid worker training, influenced manufacturing across industries for decades afterward. The organizational principles became foundational concepts in operations management and industrial engineering, the proof that traditional limits on production were not physical but conceptual. By the war's end, the reckoning was complete. Of the 151 carriers America commissioned, fewer than a dozen were lost to enemy action. Japan's carrier fleet, which had ruled the Pacific in 1941, had been annihilated. Every carrier that participated in the Pearl Harbor attack lay at the bottom of the ocean. The last survivors, pressed into hopeless battles, went down fighting enemies they could not defeat because they were outnumbered 5-1, 10-1, by ships that should not have existed yet according to every calculation Japanese planners had made. The story of the Essex-Class carriers ultimately stands as testament to industrial possibility. The ships themselves, while crucial to victory, mattered less than what their construction proved. Ordinary people, given training and purpose, could achieve extraordinary results. Complex products that traditionally required years could be manufactured in months using systematized processes. Industries that had resisted change for centuries could be revolutionized almost overnight when necessity demanded it. The Japanese admirals who never knew American welders could build an Essex-Class carrier in 16 months learned the lesson too late. By the time they understood, by the time Ozawa stood on Taiho's bridge watching carrier after carrier appear on the horizon, the war was already lost. Lost not to superior tactics or better weapons, but to an industrial system that had rewritten the rules of naval warfare. Lost to shipyards that turned steel into floating airfields faster than their enemies could comprehend. Lost to welders who, in just weeks of training, mastered techniques that would determine the fate of nations. For the pilots and sailors of the Imperial Japanese Navy, who had believed in victory through courage and sacrifice, the sight of endless American carriers was the final proof that courage alone could not overcome industrial mathematics, that no amount of fighting spirit could match an enemy who launched carriers every 90 days, that they had been fighting not just the United States Navy, but the full industrial might of a nation that had learned to mass-produce the most complex weapons of war. The Pacific War had been won in the shipyards of Virginia and New York and Pennsylvania, won by women wielding welding torches in confined spaces below the waterline, won by techniques that turned carrier construction from a multi-year craft into a 16-month process, won by an industrial transformation that Japanese admirals never saw coming and could not counter once it arrived. The battles at sea merely revealed what the shipyards had already decided. America would win because it could build carriers faster than Japan could sink them. And in the end, that was the only calculation that mattered. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, Check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.